Hello and welcome to Preparing for Work, the series that helps you transition between university and the workplace. My name's Carla. I'm a former graduate recruiter and graduate development manager, now working with the engineering careers team here in the Faculty of Engineering at UCL. So, one of the lovely jobs I have on this project is to interview alumni, so people who've been in your shoes and who have now on various stages of their career and who can share their stories and bring to life some of the subjects and the themes from Preparing for Work. If you're interested in Preparing for Work, by the way, the series is now on the Engineering YouTube channel, so please do have a look. Today, we're lucky enough to be speaking to Marc.
Thank you so much for joining us, Marc, today.
No problem. My pleasure.
Excellent. So, Marc, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit in terms of what you studied at UCL? I know your career is quite interesting, so it'd be interesting to hear kind of why you left and came back to us as well, when you graduated, and also what you've been up to since.
Sure. So like you said, I've graduated from UCL twice. Once in 2020, what was it? It's a long time ago now, about 8 years ago. Have been 2012, 2011.
Wow.
And then again, more recently, just last year in 2021, I originally studied history with a year abroad for my undergraduate, first time around. And then more recently at the engineering school, at the School of Engineering, Science and Technology and Public Policy, studied sustainable infrastructures and public policy. And so the journey between those two programs is sort of like my career to date, and probably quite interesting to explain. Because when I finished history at UCL, I wasn't too sure what I wanted to do. So I wanted to find a role that essentially would allow me to explore different industries, different topics, and different sectors. So that's why I went to work for Alpha Sites originally. They're a knowledge broker expert network that help clients find experts in given industries for topics that they're studying, for example. And I was there for about 4.5 years. And it was very interesting because it precisely gave me a lot of exposure to a lot of different sectors, everything from, retail and fashion to mining and metals, very, very broad. And what that was useful for is because as I was there, I started to work more and more on projects to do with energy and natural resources. And that introduced me to the whole world of climate change and sustainability. And I thought, okay, this is something that is very interesting to me. This is where I want to sort of move my career forwards. So after that, I went to work in the renewable sector, did a couple of different things, worked for a biogas trade association for about half a year, and similar for a battery energy storage startup. And after doing that, it was all very interesting, but it made me realize that energy was only one piece of the puzzle when it comes to sustainability. And that's actually what brought me back to UCL, in that I wanted to go back and study particularly something that would allow me to better understand sustainability as a whole. And the program at UCL at STEaPP was perfect for that, because I studied infrastructure, both energy infrastructure that I was familiar with, but then a wide variety beyond. So water, transport, all that sort of thing. And that very conveniently brought me to where I am now, which is a company called STEaPP. Very happy here because essentially this is a sort of consultancy / think tank / investment organization that looks at all areas of sustainability. So I'm currently working in their energy team because that's my background, but we also do a lot of work in materials and circularity, nature-based solutions, sustainable finance. So it sort of helped me land exactly where I want to be, somewhere where I can work on sustainability in the round. So that's sort of my career, potted history of that. Hope that sort of sheds a bit more light.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And it's so interesting that you've kind of laid some breadcrumbs for yourself along the way. And it's, it's taking you in particular directions, and it's ended up in, you've ended up in a place that you really wanted to. So it's something that I would encourage other people who may not know what they want to do to kind of try different things, and then, one thing will essentially lead to the next step. So yeah, definitely. Thank you, Mark. That's been really helpful. So what would you say to somebody who's received a job offer and is waiting to start? What would you give them in terms of advice?
Well, first I would say congratulations. It's a big achievement, so they should feel very proud. I would say that something that I found useful when being in that situation is to actually start reaching out to people in my future team that I would be working with, to better understand the sort of day-to-day dynamics of what I will be doing and prepare a little bit that way. I find that it's quite useful to do this after you have the job offer, because during the interview process, obviously organizations will try to present the best side of themselves, as is understandable. But once you have the offer and you've accepted, and they know that you're coming to join them, I think that you can get a bit more of an insight in what the actual day-to-day looks like. I think that's quite a useful thing to do. And it shows a lot of interest on your part that you want to get to know your colleagues and start building those connections early. But I would also say that if you have a job offer that you've accepted and you're waiting to start, most importantly is just relax. Like, the hard work is done. You have the offer. Very excited to begin. Any organization will make sure that you're fully trained up as much as possible when you start. So don't feel like you need to over prepare or be able to do the job perfectly from the get-go. Enjoy the time that you have before work takes over.
Yeah, I agree. I think sometimes people put a lot of pressure on themselves. All you need to do is just reach out a couple of times to sort of start, laying a few seeds and getting to know the people you'll be working with. So you don't have to kind of enjoy the time off, basically. Yeah, if you have any, because you need to have some. If you can try to get some. So what feedback would you say helped you early on in your career?
So I had a very interesting experience in my first role at AlphaSites. Essentially, a senior manager there really taught me the value of patience, essentially. Because I was 2 years in the role, and effectively the way that things worked there was, at 2 years, you had the opportunity to be promoted to a managerial position. And I, in that moment, very narrowly missed a revenue target that would have made me eligible for that promotion. And I knew that I would have another opportunity to be promoted 6 months down the line, but because I had so narrowly missed the target, I thought it was quite unfair, and it was quite disheartened that I wouldn't be considered for promotion alongside my cohort, the people that I had started with. And yeah, I was quite demoralized. And at the time, I actually thought about leaving the company, because I felt like my progression had kind of hit a bit of a wall.
Yeah.
The senior manager that I mentioned spoke to me, and he advised me not to quit, to try again in 6 months. And he basically explained to me that often graduates at the beginning of their career are quite impatient. They expect to progress very quickly. And to a graduate who's in their first role, 6 months can seem like an eternity. Like, you feel like you're standing still while everybody else is advancing very quickly. Of course, I understood that the manager who was telling me this sort of had a vested interest in me staying, right? And of course, me being there means that they wouldn't have to sort of bring someone else in and train someone else up. But I decided to follow his advice, stayed for the next 6 months, and was eventually promoted at that moment. And I'm very glad that I did that, because then going into that managerial role, I think it was a very unique experience. It allowed me to learn a lot, and probably would have been quite hard to get similar experience if I had left and gone to another organization. So he really put things in perspective for me, that to me, 6 months seemed like an insurmountable length of time. But actually, when you look at it in the grand scheme of a person's entire career that could last decades, it's really nothing. And patiently waiting 6 months to get a golden opportunity is well worth it, or at least it was in my case. So yeah, good feedback there was when it comes to timing and patience, put things in perspective, because it might weigh the options up a little differently.
Wise words. Thank you, Mark, for sharing that. I think it's really interesting that you say that, because I think one of the things I'm keen to get across in preparing for work is this idea between expectations versus reality. And certainly in my experience, 15 years of working with and training and managing graduates and interns, you sort of realize that a lot of people have different expectations, and time really is genuinely on your side, and it's your best friend, actually, because it usually takes a year to master your role even. So you need that length of time to prove your skills, but also to master those skills. So I think it's really important to kind of sometimes check in with others so that you get that kind of perspective, which is really good. And it like you say, sometimes I used to have people saying, well, I'm going to leave because I don't feel I'm being promoted or given the right opportunities, but then we'd sort of talk it through, and I think it was a sort of realization over a period of time, which helps. So that fits in very well with what I'm saying, Mark, so thank you. So in the sort of line of feedback, obviously when you're coming from university, the feedback you give is fairly safe. It's in a safe environment. Engineering in particular are very good with the introduction. I don't know if you know the IEP, but we're very good at sort of giving and receiving feedback, and the peer sort of structure with feedback is really good, actually. And we're sort of encouraging students to give and receive feedback on their peers, and it is quite uncomfortable and difficult. What advice would you give to students who now find themselves either as an intern or a graduate having to give feedback on their teammates or even their manager?
Yeah, giving feedback can be very daunting, no matter what stage you are in your career, in particular giving upward feedback to managers. But something that I found quite useful, and this was something that was taught to me at Alpha Sites as well, was in giving feedback, a lot of people are concerned about giving it because they don't want to seem like they're attacking a person, or don't want to upset the person that they're giving it to. And so the tip that I received was to try and depersonalize the feedback in a way. So to talk about a person's actions rather than the person or their personality. Right. So I had a fairly recent example in my current role, actually, where, and this was a very small instance, but illustrates it well, where I was working with my manager, who I get along with very well. But I noticed that when I had my daily meetings with him, I would bring various different points to talk about, and we would only get through the first two, because he would sort of take charge of the conversation, and we would end up only addressing the first couple of points. So we'd only have enough time to. And so rather than I decided to bring it up with him, and rather than saying, you're always interrupting me, or you sort of like dominate the conversation, I mentioned that I simply said, I often have other points that we don't manage to get to. I made it about the object rather than himself. And I thought, how can we find a way to make sure that we cover all of these points, because it would be important to do so, and I'd hate not to get your input on the remaining ones. So it was a very small but effective fix. Basically, I would send him my points in advance of the meeting so that he had them. And that way he knew that if he was getting a bit sort of carried away or going off on one of them in particular, he knew that there were others that we needed to get to, and would both of us could manage the time a bit better. So yeah, I would say frame the feedback in terms of sort of actions and behaviors rather than, that person or their character, essentially. I think that tends to go down a bit better. And then another thing on giving feedback is people tend to focus a lot on feedback as something negative or constructive, but positive feedback is also extremely useful, because if someone is doing something well, if you can be specific about what it is that they're doing well, and you tell them and they know to carry it on, that's as useful as helping them in a more on a constructive topic, for example. So yeah, it is very daunting, and it takes a lot of practice as well, giving feedback. But I would say, yeah, those 2 points, not forgetting that there's positive feedback out there to give, and it's very useful. And then when it comes to more constructive things, sort of depersonalizing it and trying to make it as objective in a sense as possible.
Thank you. That's interesting, because on one of the episodes of Preparing for Work, I talk about the boost model, so giving and receiving feedback using the boost model, and it's very much about being balanced and having that kind of observance of the act, rather than this sort of something swept in judgment. I think that's quite important, that it's, in order to be valuable, it has to be something that is entrenched in observation and lacks judgment. So yes, thank you, Mark. That really marries in with what we're saying. And just thinking about strategies, you just talked about one around sort of giving feedback. Thank you. Is there any other strategy or tool that you've used that helps improve your work, that you found that would be useful to share with other people?
I think something that has been very useful for me, and I would imagine this probably is quite, part of how a lot of UCL students and graduates think, but nonetheless, in the world of work, it's particularly valuable. It's to always reflect on the way that you're working and how to improve it. So, doing a job well is, valuable in its own right, but always thinking about how to improve your process or the way that you're doing work is actually going to, I think, help you feel like you're getting the most out of work. And it helps you stand out a lot as well, because I know from experience, having managed people, that those who are reflecting in this way and sort of always fine-tuning the way that they do things and asking for advice on that kind of initiative is gold dust for any manager, because knowing that someone is always trying to improve means that you can kind of leave them to their own devices to a much greater extent. So yeah, always reflecting, even though doing so and setting aside the time to do it in a structured way can sometimes be, it can be a fair investment of your time to actually sit down and think about these things in a cordoned off way. But it's always investment that's paid off, at least in my experience. So I would highly recommend always having that sort of reflective mindset.
Thank you. And is there anything that surprised or, pleasantly or otherwise, you in the workplace from others, that anything you've observed that you found quite interesting?
Yeah, I found that I was pleasantly surprised, I guess, in a lot of the roles that I've been in, how there was very little of the kind of unhealthy competition that people sometimes think exists in organizations, particularly very sort of like high-powered or sales-oriented organizations. I'm certain that these kind of environments exist in many organizations, but I was surprised at how little I saw that in my experience, including in roles that I've been in that have been, very target-driven, very revenue-focused, where you could easily compare yourself to other people. But I think, broadly speaking, people in the professional world want to help rather than get ahead of you.
Great.
I think that, at least in the organizations that I've been in, that's been very much the attitude. And can't say that that's going to be the case everywhere.
No.
But if you're going into an organization and you're concerned that that might be the case, I think it's worth actually getting to know the people who work there and sounding them out in this way first, because you might be pleasantly surprised at how helpful and unscary people can be in that sense.
I agree. And also it's quite scary going to a new place anyway, isn't it? It's quite nerve-wracking, especially if you've not worked very much before in the past. And it's quite an interesting jump to go from university directly into the workplace, actually. So I think we kind of underestimate that as people who've been in the work. It doesn't take too long to get used to work, so you kind of look back and you think, what was all the fuss about? But actually, you know, when you're doing it for the first time, it can be quite tricky and quite daunting. So I think your advice is excellent. Thank you, Marc. And so what's the biggest lesson so far in your career that you've learned?
I think that probably the biggest lesson has been that at the end of the day, you know, results and outcomes are what people pay attention to. And again, this was something that I learned very much from a former manager of mine at Alpha Sites, who his motto was, the only thing he was interested in was results. He didn't want to be known as sort of, he didn't care necessarily about being the friendliest person in the world or about being the most original. Like, he didn't feel like he needed to be credited for his ideas. His interest was just in getting things done and achieving good results. And I found that this was quite interesting because to some people, he came off a little bit standoffish, perhaps, a little bit perhaps unimaginative, because he was sort of trying, you know, the same things. But I think everyone enormously respected him because of the results that he was able to achieve. And that has really stayed with me. You know, I wouldn't consider myself someone who's sort of really focused on making sure that I have brilliant ideas that are associated with me and that I'm credited for. I'd much rather have someone else's idea, give them full credit for it, but apply it really well and get good results from that. So I think that's something that's sort of always at the back of my mind when I'm working, and always helping me think about, okay, what do I really need to prioritize here? And ultimately, it's always making sure that the result is good, because that's what matters and that's what people care about, I think.
What's interesting is, I think two things I take from what you've just said, Marc, as well, is that first of all, everyone has different career drivers. You know, everyone has different motivations to be where they are. For some people, it's intrinsic. Some people, it's definitely, you know, I'm here for the money. That's all I'm here for, you know. So it just depends on what your driver is and how you want to enact that driver, I guess. But also what you're saying is that you're sort of playing to your strengths. So you found something that works for you in terms of how, you know, the way you direct your work and your approach. And, you know, it works for some people and it doesn't for others. But I think the important thing is to make sure that it comes across to people, you know, to your stakeholders and to your team, and to focus in on what works for you, I think. So definitely those are my two takeaways as well. So thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting. And so, you know, sustainability is such a massive topic, and it's just going to grow and grow and grow. It's huge. So I'm thinking, you know, certainly at UCL, we're really, really interested in the topic anyway. Almost everything you touch in engineering at the moment is around sustainability. So I'm just wondering, if people want to get into this industry, how do they go about it?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, sustainability is such a huge topic, and, you know, to an extent, it can touch on everything, and it is increasingly doing so. So what I would say is, you know, a little bit like previous advice I've mentioned here, is to just speak to people who are actually in the industry or in the field that you are interested in or considering, to just try and understand, you know, what is out there and where might you fit in best and where might you be the most interested. Like, yeah, I'm trying to think of a possible example. I mean, even in my previous experience, when I was sort of moving between roles or thinking about where I wanted to go to next, my first port of call was to always speak to people who were in the field, in the industry that I was sort of looking at, and trying to understand, okay, is it as exciting and as impactful as I think it is, or perhaps not, or even if it isn't, it's still important, and where might I want to go in specifically? I would say that's definitely the first starting point, because, you know, to help make the world more sustainable, there's a million and one things that you could do, and they're all important in their own way. So it's about understanding, making sure you know what those things actually entail and which ones are the best for you.
I agree. And so how do people, if you're a student, it's quite difficult with sort of limited contacts, for example. How do you go about kind of, reaching out to people, and where do you find them?
So I would say in this respect, LinkedIn is an absolute gold dust, because if you are interested in, I don't know, let's say renewable energy, and what perked your interest was what a specific company is doing. You can learn a lot about an organization from stuff that they publish or their website, but actually reaching out to someone in the organization that you found through LinkedIn, which is a very powerful tool for actually like bringing up profiles of people who work in these organizations, is a really good way to sort of, okay, let's cut to the real detail of this. What is it that you're doing? I'm super interested. I would love to know more. And always framing it as sort of I'm interested in this field and I want to learn more, rather than, do you have any openings or jobs in this respect? Because I find that people, particularly people who work in sustainability, are often all too happy to talk about the work that they do. And if you're genuinely interested in learning about it, not because you've made up your mind about that's what you want to get into, you're really just sort of being receptive to the information that's out there. In my experience, again, I found that people are very receptive and are always happy to make time for a quick call and sort of like point you in the right direction, myself included. Like I've had people reach out to me wanting to know about, my career trajectory and sort of like what's interesting in sustainability. So yeah, I would say LinkedIn is your friend, and you will get a lot of value and a lot of opportunity from that tool alone.
I agree. And also we run events all the time with employers, come along to those events and, just grill people. They totally expect to be grilled at the time. So please, don't feel bad about, cornering them and asking them questions. Come prepared with questions, because I think that really is the one of the best ways. Like you say, recruitment processes are a bit of a sales job for you and for them. So it's important for you to do your research as much as possible, and people are the best sources for that. So yeah, I completely agree, and that's how I got this job actually. Is just purely by going around doing sort of an interview process for everybody, just grilling them over coffee and that kind of thing. Right. So obviously you work in a really interesting industry. How do you think it will grow, first of all, and secondly, what skills do you think people need to go into this job?
That's really quite hard to say, because it's growing to some extent in all directions, and I think it will continue to do so. I would say, just from my vantage point, areas like climate change and carbon emissions and that type of thing, that's already very squarely on the agenda for a lot of governments and a lot of big organizations, and it will continue to do so. But equally, there's a lot of other areas that are perhaps not receiving quite as much attention. Things like circular economy and materials, and nature and biodiversity. These are areas that, that's not to say they're not getting attention. Like there's a lot of work being done there, but I think relative to others, they could do with a lot more work. So it's hard to say. I think everything is going to grow at different speeds and to different extents. And in terms of skills, I would say it really depends on what you want to do within the industry. So myself I currently work in a sort of fairly analytical role. It was something that I hadn't done all that much in my previous roles. So the master's that I did at UCL was really valuable for that, because it helped me develop my analytical skills in ways that I hadn't done before, and with a focus on sustainability that ultimately helped get me the job that I'm in now. But had I decided to stay in more commercial roles like I had been before, then everything to do with sort of negotiation and commercial acumen and sales, then that's more important. So again, just like sustainability is a huge field, the variety of things you can do to contribute to it is also very broad. And so I think, again, understanding what it is that you want to do in there, and then speaking to the right people and tailoring your background and experience in that direction is ultimately what will get you there. Yeah, very broad answer, I know, but it's hard to pin it down to something specific unless somebody knows exactly what they're going for.
Absolutely, and they'll only know that through interviewing. And I definitely would recommend, if people are sort of talking to individuals who work in various areas, is to find out also about their own career trajectory, what skills they learned, what qualifications they got, you know, how do they even get into this industry, you know, and sort of emulate some of that if that is of interest. So you know, that's the beauty of talking to people, isn't it? And I know it's scary, but it's definitely something that is worth doing. Sort of, it is networking, and we all have to do it. Even if working virtually, we still have to do it. But you know, it's a wonderful skill to have. Thank you so much, Marc. You know, everything you talked about today is completely relevant and really interesting. And you've had a very interesting career, so thank you for sharing that as well. And to students and graduates, if any of the themes that came up today is of interest, you want to explore this further, please do feel free to book some time in with a careers consultant, or come to events and speak to employers. But otherwise, you'll find the, as I say, the episodes of Preparing for Work on the Engineering YouTube channel. Thank you again, Marc, for all your time today. We really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. Happy to help.
Thank you.